Hello, my name is James Gauna, and this is my podcast about Sweeney Todd and its relationship to Gothic Romanticism. Quick trigger warning before we start. This podcast will have mention of rape and cannibalism and gore in general. So now that we got that out of the way, what are we going to be talking about today? So, the musical Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, has always been used as an example of how the horror genre can switch mediums to that of a musical. It was kind of the first musical that took on the horror genre. So, through the use of multiple books, journal articles, and dissertations, I will be comparing and contrasting Sweeney Todd to Der Leiermann from the Winterreise song cycle by Schubert, to basically prove that Sweeney Todd could be fit under the umbrella of Gothic Romanticism, because Der Leiermann has always been seen as a really good example. The whole Winterreise song cycle has been seen as a really good example of the Gothic Romantic genre. So let's dive into it. What is Gothic Romanticism? Gothic Romanticism is a musical movement that took place in the 19th century to the early 20th century. It took place alongside the Romantic era, and it just kind of incorporated more horror and more darker tones to the Romantic period as a whole. From Charles Allen's Muller's dissertation, Music of the Goth Subculture, Postmodernism and Aesthetics, page 97, he states that Gothic works often deal with personal or national tragedies and horrors, and the ability to achieve transcendence from them. So basically what this is saying is that works that fall under the Gothic umbrella are horror stories and, darker themes, but we still find them beautiful. And that takes us to our next quote from Holly Hurst's book chapter, Georgette Heyer and the Redefining of the Gothic Romance, from the book Georgette Heyer, History and Historical Fiction, page 106 through 107. She states, "In approaching the Gothic romance, we must examine the intersection between Gothic mode and romance, how both function symbolically to provide entertainment, fantasy, comfort, and even escape, while simultaneously offering complex and multivalent engagements with a wide range of topics and concerns, from the relational and psychological to the social." So in this quote, she's basically drawing parallels between the Gothic mode and romance and romanticism as a whole. And at its core, they do both provide very similar things. And they're kind of just opposite sides of the spectrum in a way, but they can come together very well to create something gorgeous. From Dale Townshend and Angela Wright's book chapter, Gothic and Romantic and Historical Overview, from the book Romantic Gothic and Edinburgh Companion, page 28, they state, "We are fortunate then in entering the 21st century with a version of literary history that no longer reads the Gothic and the Romantic as oxymoronic, but as complementary, symbolic, and indeed inseparable forms." Basically stating that these two terms, like I said, as they've always been seen as oxymorons, different sides of the spectrum, they are at its core complementary and inseparable forms. They can't really be separated from each other in super distinct ways. Gothic is always going to have those qualities of romantic, and romantic is always going to have some qualities of Gothic. And what are those qualities? What are some of the characteristics of Gothic Romanticism? Well, from Isabella van Elfrin's book, chapter Gothic and Contemporary Music, Dark Sound, Dark Mood, Dark Aesthetics, from the book The Edinburgh Companion to Gothic in the Arts, page 230, she states, "It is possible, however, to distinguish a certain amount of consistent characteristics, such as minor keys, descending melodies, moderate tempi, and foreground bass structures, but these musical parameters, while important, are not the key feature of Gothic music. The key characteristics of all Goth music is as ungraspable as it is undeniable. It is dark." Basically, all the things that when you listen to a piece of music, you think it's kind of creepy, kind of unsettling. All of those things are what make the Romantic Gothic sound the way it does. It's very dark as a sound. The tonalities are very dark, and the minor keys are one of the biggest things about it. It's something that minor keys have always been something that kind of are the big thing in Romantic Gothic music. Basically, most things from the Romantic era, if it is primarily in a minor key and stays in that minor key, it's going to be telling a darker story. From Isabella van Elfrin's book chapter Gothic Game Music, Hyper Haunted Reality, from the book Gothic Music, The Sounds of the Uncanny, she states, like the film scores analyzed in chapter 2, it creates a language of transgression through an accumulation of dissonance, stingers, crescendos, and white noise. These are just a couple more qualities that make Gothic music sound the way it does, Romantic Gothic music sound the way it does. Just kind of crunchier chords, very sudden crescendos, and just like kind of a more distorted feeling. And so now that we have what the Gothic Romantic is, let's move on to Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street. This is a musical premiered in 1979, and it is based on a 1973 play of the same name. The score was written by Stephen Sondheim, and the book was written by Hugh Wheeler. It won Best New Musical at the Tonys the year it premiered. It's a very well-known musical. It was one of my favorites. And just a summary of the show. It tells of a man who goes by the name of Sweeney Todd and his friend Anthony, who dock in London, and Todd goes to a meat pie shop where he meets Miss Lovett. And after Todd asks for the upstairs apartment, Lovett tells the story of the guy who used to be there. His name was Benjamin Barker, and he was sent away on false charges. And when he was sent away, the judge took Barker's wife, raped her, and took their infant daughter, Joanna, as a ward. And his wife ended up poisoning herself. So, based on his reactions, Miss Lovett realizes that Sweeney Todd is Benjamin Barker. And so she promises to keep his secret, and she ends up giving him his old straight razors. And so he ends up becoming a barber. So while this whole exchange is happening, Anthony sees Joanna, who's in her early 20s at this point, at the judge's window. He doesn't know that it's Barker's / Sweeney Todd's daughter, and he immediately basically falls in love with her. And so then Todd notices a very crowded London marketplace, and a man named Adolfo Pirelli is showing off a new elixir, which is basically a cure for hair loss, and he has his assistant Tobias nearby. So Todd goes and investigates and basically disproves the elixir, and then challenges Pirelli to a shaving contest, which Todd wins very easily because he was a great barber. A while later, Pirelli shows up with Tobias at Sweeney Todd's shop and reveals that he is one of Sweeney Todd's former friends, and he attempts to blackmail Todd, basically going to tell everybody who he really is. And so Todd does the only reasonable thing that he can think of and murders him. While discussing what to do with the body with Miss Lovett, she suggests using the meat in her pies. Meat is expensive, so she was like, maybe we can get some cheap produce for the pies. And so a few weeks later, Todd and Lovett have taken in Tobias, because Pirelli's dead now, and revitalized Lovett's shop using human flesh in the pies. And Judge Turpin ends up finding out about Anthony and Joanna's kind of elopement and sends her off. And so Anthony searches London for Joanna, and he finds her in an insane asylum. And he goes up to Todd and asks for advice, and Todd tells him basically to disguise himself and go rescue her. But then he turns around and sends a letter to the judge saying that he's going to hand over Joanna at his shop that night. So while all of this is kind of unraveling, Toby starts to worry that Sweeney Todd is going to hurt Miss Lovett, and he is very protective of her. She's very much a mother figure to him. And so to distract him from that, she takes him to the bakehouse, which is where they grind the meat and keep the bodies. And he locks Toby in there. She locks Toby in there. Sorry, my bad. After she does this, she goes back into the shop and finds the judge's assistant investigating because neighbors complained about weird smoke and smells coming from the bakehouse. So she's like, we'll go upstairs. And Todd ends up killing him and uses his special chair to send the corpse down to the bakehouse, which Toby is in. And Toby ends up seeing the body and kind of figures out what's going on. And so he decides to try to escape through the sewers. Anthony finds Joanna and helps her escape the insane asylum, and they go to Todd's shop and finds it empty due to Todd and Lovett searching the sewers for Toby. And so Joanna ends up hiding after they hear a beggar woman enter the shop. She kind of seems to recognize the place a little bit, which is a little weird. And so Todd ends up coming in and tries to get her to leave. And then he starts hearing the judge coming up the stairs. And so he kills her in a panic and drops the body down into the bakehouse. And so the judge enters the shop, and while they're waiting for Joanna, because Anthony was supposed to bring Joanna back to Todd's shop. So they're waiting, and the judge is like, can I have a splash of cologne just to spruce up a bit? And while he's in the chair, the judge ends up recognizing him as Benjamin Barker. And so while this is happening, Todd slits his throat and sends him down the chute. And he starts heading downstairs before realizing that he left his razors in his shop. So he goes back up, and Joanna exits from her hiding place, and Todd doesn't really recognize her. And so he's like, somebody else is in my shop that I don't know. And so he tries to kill her, but then at one point Miss Lovett down in the bakehouse starts shrieking, which gives Joanna a perfect opportunity to escape. So she does, and he rushes down to the bakehouse, and Miss Lovett is fighting with Judge Turpin, who isn't quite dead yet, but once he's done, she's trying to put the beggar woman's body in the oven. And that's when Sweeney Todd looks at the beggar woman for the first time, really looks at her, and realizes that it's his wife. And so he kind of goes off on Miss Lovett, saying, you lied to me, you lied to me. And she says she did actually poison herself. And then Miss Lovett confesses her love for Sweeney Todd. And so in kind of a maniacal way, they start dancing, and Sweeney Todd ends up throwing Miss Lovett in the oven. And Toby is kind of entering back up into the bakehouse from the sewers and sees all of this, And so while Sweeney Todd is holding the body of his dead wife, Toby comes up and slits his throat. It's a very dark musical. It has a lot of very, very dark themes in it. And it wasn't always accepted. A lot of people had very off feelings about it. As shown in Senda Akihiko's book, The Voyage of Contemporary Japanese Theater. The book chapter is Laughter in the Gothic Music, page 169. She states, doubtless the show struck a sour note with many, so far removed as it was from the familiar conventions of romance, comedy, and a healthy humanism that had been the mainstays of the musical. So like I said, it was very, it was very jarring because people hadn't really seen a musical like this yet. They hadn't really seen something so dark and gritty. And so this was kind of the first time that these darker themes were being put in musicals. And I mean, another showing of it not being well received was from the article from the Three Penny Review, number 107. The segment title is Theater for Grown-Ups by Steve Weinberg, page 19. In its original mounting, Sweeney Todd was too heavy and pretentious and way too long for anything as frivolous as a penny dreadful with music. So it was very heavy. It was a very... It wasn't well received because of the dark message behind it. Because it deals with things like rape, like murder, like cannibalism, like in even the late 1900s, these weren't super prominent things, like maybe, rated R movie, but they weren't really expecting that from a musical. But it ended up being a very, very popular musical. And in composing it, this is from the article Sondheim and the Musical from the Musical Times, volume 128, number 1735, page 490 by Tom Sutcliffe. It says, Sondheim is a conservative who believes content dictates form. He starts from character, aiming to set the situation, the tone, the mood clearly. So this is starting to get into kind of the musical qualities of Sweeney Todd that kind of make it darker. And this shows that when he was composing, Sondheim took the content of the musical, because it was based off a play, so he knew what the story was, and he took that and used that to dictate his music, as he should. That's kind of how a lot of composers write their music, and it starts out by saying Sondheim is a conservative. He had these older ideals and older processes, and so it was very reminiscent of that. It has darker tones throughout the show, even though it picks up in certain pieces. So getting more into that, this is from the article From the Beggar's Opera to Sweeney Todd, The Art of the Broadway Orchestrator, from the Music Educator's Journal, volume 66, number 9, page 35, by Amy Parent. It says, the show's atmosphere is created by using eerie sound effects, string harmonics, woodwinds scored in the extreme upper and lower registers, and a whole spectrum of unusual brass sounds are an integral part of the score. So yeah, when he was composing this, he had those super high registers in most of the instruments, especially in the woodwinds and the strings, and just kind of unsettling sounds from the brass section. All of this stuff that he put in this musical to kind of create this gothic romantic feeling to it. And then straight from the score itself, I'll be kind of looking at the Ballad of Sweeney Todd primarily, which is the last big company piece. There's a lot of descending melodies, which is, like we learned earlier, one of the hallmarks of Gothic romantic music and like darker sounding music. There's some crunchiness in the chords, dissonance. Obviously, it's in a minor key. There's a lot of chromaticism in it, especially towards the end, that makes it super creepy, because that chromaticism and that dissonance is what drives that uneasy feeling, because we have all these pretty pieces that we know and love that are built on triads and built on major and minor thirds. You know, it's not really something that chromaticism is not really something that we hear a lot in quote unquote pretty pieces. And so that kind of sets us at the edge of our seat just a little bit and really drives home the creepiness. And then there's also a motif that's very, very, very prominent, or I guess a musical idea that's very prominent in both the first song and the last song. It's da 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 da, which is just a bunch of seconds and a minor third. So it's like it's not the most comfortable. It's very eerie. It's very unsettling. And I mean, Sondheim composed it to be that way because that's kind of the message he wanted to start off the musical with and end the musical with, because the first and last songs are very similar, which a lot of musicals do. And it really helps set the scene that this is going to be kind of a horror musical. And it has a lot of those very horror ideals in it, and it deals with a lot of stuff from like the horror genre. And so that's kind of the things that make Sweeney Todd fit into that genre of the Gothic romantic, in my opinion. But to kind of strengthen my point, I also want to talk about Der Leiermann, which is the 24th song in the Winterreise song cycle by Schubert. It was published in 1828, and it's based off of a bunch of poems by Wilhelm Müller, and it basically tells the story of lost love. In the first song, it's kind of telling us about him falling in love and then losing his love. And then the rest of the song cycle, the other 23 songs, are about kind of his grief journey. And so this last one, in English, it's called the Hurdy Girdy Man. And the poem goes as such. There beyond the village stands a hurdy-gurdy man, and with numbered fingers he grinds away as best he can. Barefoot on ice he totters to and fro, and his little plate remains always empty. No one wants to listen, no one looks at him. And the dogs snarl around the old man, and he lets everything go on, as it will turns, and his hurdy-gurdy never stops. Strange old man, shall I go with you? Will you grind your hurdy-gurdy to my songs? So basically he goes into this village, and he sees an older guy playing a hurdy-gurdy. And he's kind of watching this man who isn't making any money from this because nobody's giving him tips. He's basically a street performer. And he wonders, shall I go with you? Like, will you accompany my songs? And so the way I kind of interpret this is the hurdy-gurdy man to me is death. And that's how a lot of academics also think about it. Like, shall I go with you? Will you help me? And so I think that he's thinking about using death as the option. And so it's very dark, and it once again encapsulates kind of the Gothic romantic idea. In a quote from the article Retracing a Winter's Journey, Reflections on Schubert's Winterreise from the 19th Century Music, Volume 9, Number 2, page 131 by Susan Ewens. She states, according to most interpretations, the wanderer is either close to death or goes mad, usually the latter. One writer even claims to find clinical evidence of schizophrenia in Der Lehrmann. So part of this that I'm really focusing on is the close to death. Like, he, in his journey, isn't necessarily the most mentally stable. He lost his love. He doesn't know if he wants to go on. And it's very detrimental to him. You know, he's very scared of going on because he doesn't feel like he has reason anymore. And that's very much shown in a quote from a book chapter, Epilogue, The Meaning of Death in Winterreise, from the book Death in Winterreise, Museo Poetic Associations and Schubert Song Cycle, page 194 by Laurie Serpa. She states, only in Der Lehrmann is the speaker ready to accept all loss of humanity, a totally numb state devoid of any emotions, but the cycle ends before we know what happens. Does he take the final step towards such state, or does he simply declare his willingness to do so? Right? Because in the poem, he asks the question, shall I go with you? But that's the end. Shall I go with you? Will you grind your hurdy-gurdy to my songs? Like, that is the end of that song. That is the end of that poem. We don't know if he goes with the old man. We don't know if he ends up using death as the option. We don't know if he talks himself out of it. You know, it's very open-ended. From a doctoral thesis titled Motivic Unity in Schubert's Winterreise by Mitchell Mark Lee, page 220, states, many of the ideas advanced about this song are quite understandably concerned with its existential nature. It appears to have come from a timeless place that almost transcends music itself. Like, this problem that he has, like, with is death the option, is very timeless. Everybody has always wondered that question. There have always been people who have thought about it. And it's very existential. Like, we don't know what happens. Like, we don't genuinely know what happens after we die. And so we don't know if it is the answer. And it's a very dark question to ask. But it's one that is very much asked in Der Lehrmann. And it, once again, keeps with these ideas, these gothic ideas, these darker ideas. And the music itself also very much shows these darker ideas. In the score itself, we have the minor key, and at times, especially in the piano, it has a descending melody, but also in the voice at times it has a descending melody. It stays completely in the key, which is something that's very different than Sweeney Todd, which uses a bunch of dissonance. Because Sweeney Todd does use dissonance, but this one stays in the key, but still holds that same creepy tone, if not having more of a creepy tone. But I think one thing that helps Winterreise stay in that creepy tone is open fifths in the left hand of the piano throughout. It is just open fifths the entire time. And that open fifths have always been something that are very unsettling because we don't really know what it's doing. There's a perfect fifth in there, but that is the outline of either a minor or a major triad. And so not knowing, is it a minor or is it a major triad, is very unsettling. throughout the piece, and it rings like a bell every measure, and it just creates kind of an unsettling feeling to not knowing. And just, it's a very well written song because it does leave the listener wondering, and that is very well shown in a book chapter titled Der Leiermann from the book Retracing a Winter's Journey, Franz Schubert's Winterreise by Susan Ewens. She states, by the end of the song, not even the sustained full tonic chord on the strong first beat and the tonic pitch in the topmost voice can convince the ear of termination. Rather, the last chord seems like a blind or a bar shutting us out from implied continuance beyond the fermata. This music is the symbol for what the wanderer fears and foretells his future to be, sounding nothing less and horrifying. It has potential to go on and on beyond bearing. So even though the downbeat of the last measure is a full tonic chord, it's a full minor tonic chord, and the tonic pitch is in the soprano, so normally that would be a perfect authentic cadence, but because of the way it's voice led and just the whole piece is composed, it doesn't feel final. It doesn't feel like it ended. It feels like there's more to the story, and it feels like you could very easily continue the song, but it doesn't continue. It stops. And that open-endedness, I think, is what creeps out a lot of people because we don't know what happens. And it's the fear of the uncertainty that really establishes Winterreise as a whole, but specifically Der Leiermann in that Gothic romantic genre. So, after talking about both Der Leiermann and Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, I have come to the conclusion that I do think you can put Sweeney Todd as a whole into this Gothic romantic genre, because it does keep a lot of very classical elements, very romantic era elements to its composition, but it also tells a dark story, and I think that dark story is what really drives the music. And so while you do have very pretty harmonies, they are very unsettling harmonies because of the story that the music is portraying. There's not really any light in the musical because everything goes wrong. You know, like, Sweeney Todd didn't plan on killing Pirelli, but he felt like he had to. And even though the pie shop opens up and everybody loves the pies, we know that they're made with human meat, which isn't exactly the most comforting. And then he ends up killing his wife and trying to kill his daughter. It's a musical that tells a story of how revenge can change you as a person. And it leaves a lot to be said about revenge and these feelings of dread that we always feel sometimes. And it really grasps what the Gothic romantic is about, which is telling these darker stories through classical composing. And I think Sondheim did that very, very, very well. Thank you for listening.